I want to thank you so much, dear Katri, for joining us. It's really a pleasure to talk to you. I am in Verona, which is in the northern part of Italy. Why don't we start with a little presentation of yourself? Tell us something for people that are probably see you for the first time. Hello and welcome to Obehi podcast. I'm your host, Obehi A14, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started with this episode.
I'm Catherine Fletcher. I'm a professor of history at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. I have been to Verona, actually, not for quite some time, but I do a lot of research on Italian history, particularly the period of the Italian Renaissance. So I travel to Italy a lot for archive research, to study the past, to see all the historic buildings. And of course, when I'm doing this, I think I'm at work, but my friends think I'm on holiday because they always see over here in the UK, people think of going to Italy. That's something you do for a holiday, take a break. And I'm like, no, I'm working. I am in the archive 9 to 5, doing that archive study, trying to find out all these details of the past. But yeah, they never quite believe me.
So it means that you are using one stone to kill two birds now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, doing history is great fun, but it takes, a lot of sitting around, a lot of chasing after little details that, you might, that might not prove very fruitful in the end. But when it works and you find something that's really exciting, it's absolutely fantastic feeling.
That's interesting. I remember the other day I was talking to a professor of history in Nigeria. In fact, we did a lot on this particular topic on history, the importance of history, and it was really very interesting at the end of the day because I was trying to understand why do we even have to study history. Looking at Nigeria, for example, where the history had to be removed from our curriculum, something that it sort of made me want to vomit. I don't know how they could ever do a thing like that. But anyway, now let's come back to you, dear Katri. Tell me a little bit about yourself growing up. I want to understand who was this little Katri that was growing up as a girl. Yeah, tell us.
Oh, well, I was born in Birkenhead, which is in the northwest of England, actually not very far from where I live now, but we moved up to Scotland when I was 9. My father was a musician. He played the cello latterly he played the cello in the Scottish National Orchestra. So I grew up with quite a lot of cultural education. It's not necessarily a very well-paid job being a musician, but it was kind of a reasonably comfortable upbringing. And I went back to Liverpool to university initially to study politics. I was really interested in politics and how the world works in the present. And for a little while after that, I was quite involved in politics myself. I worked in the media for a little while for the BBC, but eventually I kind of got to a point where I wanted a slightly slower pace of life than constantly working in 24-hour news where you're just kind of reporting one thing after another. And I had got interested in history, partly after a trip to Italy. I went to Florence. That was back in 1999, I think. So quite a long time ago now. And I was very intrigued. And so I took an evening class in London just about the history of that period. And I went on from there and gradually made it my career.
So what became more fascinating for you about history to make you want to switch gear at a point?
I think it was just a sense that where I was working at that point, we were talking about, things that were happening very much in the present day, whether that was, the war in Iraq that there was around then, kind of course, like 9/11 happened when I was in, when I was working in that job. There was, a lot of things going on, but we tended to take a very, very short-term view of it. And I always thought, you can perhaps learn more by paying attention to, not just the medium-term history, but also to the very much longer-term history. And I was just thinking to myself, like, perhaps this would be something that would be interesting to explore more for myself. And I really enjoyed doing it. I really enjoyed learning more. And I was always quite enjoyed, I quite enjoyed education and teaching and learning and finding more things out and just generally being curious about the world.
That's interesting. All right. Now, you've been to Italy a number of times. Of course, Italy is very important in Europe and in the West, as it were, for relevance in terms of history, culture, and in many things. So, if this is where you get what they call the spark in Italy, it's called the scintilla, where you spark about, where you begin to have more interest about history. So, they make a lot of sense that we are talking about a person from Italy today, which is Alessandro Medici, which is whom you have written a book about. So, give me a background of this story that you have worked on.
So yeah, I first came across Alessandro actually when I was writing a previous book. I was writing about the divorce of King Henry VIII of England, and this very, very famous event in English history. Henry VIII gets divorced from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, but in order to do that, he has to break from the church in Rome, the Catholic Church, because the Pope refuses him this divorce. And I wrote a book about that. And I was intrigued by the reasons that the Pope was refusing Henry his divorce. Why was he doing that? Well, it's a number of things, but one of them is that he's really, really keen to get his family, the Medici, back into power in Florence. And the particular person that is involved in this story is a nephew of the Pope. Some people say he's the Pope's son. I'm a little bit skeptical about that account. But anyway, an illegitimate child of the family who's called Alessandro de' Medici. And Alessandro, according to these stories, is black, or he's mixed race, or he's the son of a slave. The source material is a little bit shaky on the precise background of Alessandro, but he becomes, quite astonishingly, due to this whole series of coincidences of inheritance, Duke of Florence. He's born in 1512. He is Duke by 1532, so really, really young, only around the age of 20. And then he is murdered 5 years later. So it's this incredibly dramatic life story of an astonishing rise to power from being somebody who essentially doesn't even appear in the historical records when he's first born. We don't know anything about his very, very early childhood, and yet rises to rule one of the 5 major states of Italy at that time. And I was just very, very fascinated to learn more about this story. So when I was talking to my agent and my publisher about what I might write next after the Henry VIII book, they were very, very keen on this idea that perhaps I should write about Alessandro.
The relationship between the church, if you want to call it religion, and the state, is it something that you work about a lot? Because you talked about the marriage of King Henry, which of course led to the breakup of, I don't know if it was a breakup or a separation, where the Anglican of course came in, because now you have the Anglican, which was actually supposed to be part of the Catholic Church. Now you have the Catholic Church that is under Rome, then you have Anglican that is under the British power, as it were. So I want you to tell me a little bit about this holy romance, if you want to call it like that.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who studies this period of history is immediately struck by just how important religious life is. It's very, very embedded into the life of the community. You know, all the festivals, the rituals of the year are structured around saints' days. It's a very practical religious life that people just sort of engage in almost without being very conscious of engaging in it sometimes. It's not something that you necessarily kind of stop and think about. It's just something that you do. And so, yeah, when you're thinking about how people operate in the 16th century, you have to think about religion. And I mean, this whole issue with the popes and what they are at that point is also very interesting because, you know, nowadays we have this idea the Pope is a religious leader. He has his little base in the Vatican, but the Vatican is a very small state. But at the time, the popes were the rulers of a much, much bigger area of Italy. Like, so it goes all the way up to Bologna, all the way across to Ravenna, and then down to Rome. So they are also in charge of just sort of ordinary kind of politics, looking after defense, looking after taxes, all those normal things that states have to do. And it's quite a tricky job for any individual to reconcile that role on the one hand of being a religious leader, and on the other hand being a political leader and having to deal with the practicalities and compromises that come with running a big and complicated state. So he's there, and the Anglican Church is a whole other issue, because it's very much, as you say, it's a state church. It exists. It was set up and it existed to serve the needs of the English crown, what Henry VIII told it to do. And theologically, certainly at first, it wasn't very different from the Catholic Church. Then sort of becomes a little bit more Protestant over time, but really, there's still quite a lot of space for people who are quite theologically Catholic within the Anglican confession. So yeah, we get a lot of tensions now within that international church.
Apart from the marriage of King Henry, which the Pope didn't want to accept, was there anything that actually led to Anglican leaving the Catholic Church?
Obviously, at the same time, there is a movement that comes to be called Protestantism, led from 1517 by Martin Luther in the German states, but also then picking up very, very rapidly. And Henry VIII himself wasn't sympathetic to the Protestants at all, but they had a set of different ideas to challenging the Catholic Church, challenging aspects of its theology, challenging the role of priests in mediating between individual members of the Church and God. So these ideas of Protestantism do influence some of the people around Henry VIII, including Thomas Cromwell, who becomes his chief minister, including Anne Boleyn, who becomes his second wife. So there is an element of Protestant influence in that decision to split from the Catholic Church, but it's not the only factor there. So there's a number of different things flowing in. There's always a debate in English history, I think, about whether or not England would have become Protestant had it not been for Henry VIII's desire to leave his first wife. But there was certainly a lot of Protestant influence around, and I think it's quite possible it would have happened, just perhaps in a slightly different way.
Mm-hmm. I see. At the end of the day, history sometimes is it's a combination of a lot of things. No, it's not just one simple thing that explains it all. I think that is why we need the historian to continuously help us to interpret the event. No, because it's not just one event. Because you look at the history of a man, of a person. And this person is not simply good or bad, or has just done one thing or two things. He has done a multiples of things. So, but that is very important. Now, coming back to the story of Alessandro de Medici, tell me something about the research that you underwent to dig up this story or to make a book about him. What did you do in terms of research?
So, my first stop was after I read what had been written around Alessandro's life so far by other scholars. My first stop was to go to the archives in Florence and basically call up as many documents as I could that had been written in Alessandro's time. Now, this was quite a tricky task because actually a lot of the political archive from that period does not survive. So we have it's kind of a little bit like doing a jigsaw, really. So I was putting together all these different documents that might tell us something about what Alessandro was like as a ruler. Now, one of the big sets of documents I had that were fantastic were the wardrobe accounts. So this is a set of accounts that describe clothes that he wore, furniture that he had. We can make guesses then about how his palace was decorated. We can make guesses about what type of outfits they were wearing when they entertained. We can link certain outfits to certain trips. We can think about the type of imagery that he might have had hanging on his wall. So we get a sense of the personal taste from those documents. Then we have some limited amount of government correspondence, which gives you a little flavor of the way that he was governing, quite a serious concern for law and legal rights, quite a concern to promote himself as a just ruler who took the interests of people from all social backgrounds seriously. We get some quite gossipy letters, not so much in Florence itself, but in other archives. The letters, there's a great set of letters in Mantua that are written by somebody corresponding with the Dukes of Mantua, who's telling them all about what's going on in Florence. And from there, we learn a little bit more about Alessandro's personal relationships. So for me, it was then a matter of taking all this material and working out how to put it together into a life story. What aspects of Alessandro's life to think about and to dig into. And there are some, once I'd done a Florentine research, I went out and I looked at other archives too. There's some incredible material, records of a murder trial in Rome, for example, which this is a great story of family rivalry between Alessandro and a cousin called Ippolito, who was a little bit older and thought that he should have become Duke of Florence and not Alessandro. So there's a real murderous rivalry between the two of them. And so through that, we can explore some of the dynamics of family honor and vendetta and the way that political assassination was very widely used in that period to deal with the enemies of a ruler. So all these kind of documents feed into my writing process.
Thank you for that, dear Catherine. All right, now, the story of this individual is very important, no? In that it's really quite intriguing, looking at his origin, where it's coming from, looking at the position of the church, looking at the position that he came to occupy, and looking at the condition of his death. And now looking at the document that we can find today to tell his story. How simple are these things, no? I mean, if he was sick and he died, and if he was popularly loved, maybe there could have been a lot of documentation about him. What I'm trying to say here is that there are even the opinion of others or the conclusion of others that his story have actually deliberately been wiped out so that we don't know a lot about him. I don't know if that is what you find, or it was very easy for you to find all the evidence you were looking to construct your story. Help me with that.
Well, I think certainly it's true that Alessandro was very much painted as the bad guy quite quickly on by the historians who worked for the later members of the Medici family. And I think what happens in this period in the 1530s is that the Medici go from pretending really that they are just the most prominent family in a republican system of government. So, a system like in Italy today, there is no monarch. There is a system of elections, not as broad and democratic a system as there is now, but certainly some system of electing the rulers, in which the Medici just kind of operated by being oligarchs who pulled strings, but not by being the hereditary dukes. And in the 1530s, they basically make themselves, with the patronage of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and his military backing, so a foreign ruler from the Italian point of view, they make themselves pretty much the kind of absolute rulers of the city. So they really make any sense of elections pretty meaningless. Alessandro is in charge. And his successor members of the Medici family will be in charge. Now, making that change of government, essentially the regime change, is not a popular thing to do. It basically involves bringing in foreign military backing, building a massive fort in the city to make sure you get your way and you can control any potential rebellions. It's a pretty brutal process. It involves a siege of the city, which is not over months, in which people are effectively, being starved if they don't agree to give in. So this is a very brutal process by which the Medici make themselves absolute Dukes of Florence. Now, in that context, it becomes convenient later on to blame Alessandro for all the bad things that were done and say that was kind of about him personally. I mean, it wasn't really about him personally. No Renaissance ruler ever gets there by being a nice guy. It was a family strategy. in which he was one player, and yeah, he went along with it. But I think, yeah, there is a process of, sometimes it's about, you know, the clearly a lot of his papers disappear. We don't know where they went, but it's also not just about saying he wasn't there, but saying that, well, you know, a lot of bad things happened when the Medici became dukes, but they were all Alessandro's fault personally, because he was a tyrant. He was individually a bad guy. And also bringing in his background and his heritage, saying that on account of his mother, who was enslaved or who was mixed race, or the various different versions of what exactly is said about his mother, but basically suggesting that he was unsuitable to rule. And especially as you go later on, you come forward to the 19th century, when you see historians talking about this, they make quite an explicit connection between Alessandro's race and him being a bad ruler. So there's lots of different things going on here. At the time, in the 16th century, they tend not to make such a sharp connection between race and rulership. But as you come forward, the historians, and writing in the context of so-called sort of scientific racism later on in the 19th and into the 20th century, they absolutely do that. So there's a lot of unpicking to do of understanding how his story was subsequently written and how that relates to what might have really happened back in the 1530s when he was actually in charge of a city.
And it's not like if we talk about it, we will definitely just rewrite the story in turn it upside down. That's not the intention. The intention is that we are human beings, and as human beings, let's begin to talk about our experience, who we are, where we are coming from, what have we done. The reason for this is so that we can learn, because we need to learn. If we don't learn from history, then we continue to repeat the same error. Now, just like the Medici, Alessandro de Medici, there are many other Africans influences in Europe whom, unfortunately, we don't happen to read about because sometimes they are deliberately written off. Or maybe, like you were saying before, is because of this erroneous connection between race and be bad. So if we identify the person's history, seeing that he is not a typical European of a person, so we have a way of painting the person to be bad, even though you have done something good, then we just look for a way to write the person off. Of course, this is a very complicated story. We both know that, because it's a guy that was assassinated in his position. It's not that he jumped from somewhere, and he was also representing authority, the power that be, as it were. So how does this become an issue? So help me explain that better, please.
Yeah, I think, well, a part of it is that, the way that the Medici family get power back in Florence. So they've been kicked out of Florence 3 years earlier, in 1527. There's a rebellion. People in Florence decide that they don't want the Medici in power anymore. They feel that they've, started to exceed their power beyond what they ought to have, that they're not ruling very legitimately. And so there's an uprising, and the Medici flee into exile. So when Alessandro comes along as a very young, probably around about the kind of 18, 19, 20, as the Medici family are trying to get back into power, because the Medici use the support primarily of the Spanish army, and because what they do is they arrange a marriage between Alessandro and an illegitimate daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who's also the King of Spain. Alessandro is perceived as coming into Florence with really as a person who is only there by virtue of the fact that he has this foreign military support. So he is, in that sense, yes, he's a member of the Medici family, and yes, that is a Florentine family, though he isn't. He's an illegitimate member of the family, so his parents weren't married. We don't know quite who his mother is. His father is supposed to be Duke Lorenzo de' Medici, but some people say it's actually the Pope, Clement VII. So there's lots of questions about his own legitimacy personally within the family, about the fact that he comes in really and is placed in power with this external military support that is not from Florence itself. And people accept his rule, but they don't accept his rule really to some extent because they're a little bit worn out of constant wars and fighting. So it's a little bit of a default acceptance. And then he really has to work to win the people round. And he puts a lot of effort actually into doing that. He starts to organize festivals and entertainments to try to deal with the rising food prices. He does he tries to make sure that he's quite careful about the way he runs the judicial system, for example. So there are lots of positive things. He's quite a populist ruler in a way. He makes an effort to appeal to the lower social classes. But yeah, as I say, there are always some people who are going to say, either on account of his birth or on account of the foreign military support, or both, that he's not really there because the people in Florence want him to be.
All right. I like that. Even in many countries of the world today, we have leaders that we wouldn't even want them to be there, but politics is a complex thing. When we talk of political assassination of president, of leader, even in the ancient time, sometimes it can even be the person was born there, he grew up there, he never went to any place, he had been there, but sometimes it can be killed too. So what I'm actually trying to drive at here is, since when did this question of illegitimacy became an issue? Was it before Alessandro got to power, before he died, or after he died? I'm trying to understand how the story was actually constructed. Mm-hmm. Okay, to be very simple.
So already, even under his when his father Lorenzo was in charge of Florence, there are people criticizing Lorenzo, and there are people who write, people who are political enemies of the Medici, who are never nice about any of the Medici. They always criticize. They criticize Alessandro. They sort of say, oh, well, the Medici haven't got any legitimate children. They've only got these two little bastards. These, they're not. They talk about them as entirely unsuitable to rule, and they just generally don't like the Medici. They call them tyrants. It's perfectly true. I mean, back in the 15th century, you go back 50 years before Alessandro, the Medici have been very extensively criticized. It's well known that they were helping themselves to state funds to support their private lifestyles. So it's not it's not the case that everybody always loved the Medici. Florence was very factional. It was very split. You have different sides. So when Alessandro comes in, one of the things I think we have to try and do is to disentangle a little bit which aspects of the criticism are general criticism that would have been applied to any member of the Medici family, and which aspects of them are very specific to him as an individual, to his race, to his social status, to the fact that he was not born within a legitimate marriage. All of these things, and it's often quite difficult to tell, because sometimes people who are really making political criticisms will also just throw in the fact, oh, his mother was Moorish, or oh, his mother was half Negro, this type of language. And they will say those things within the context of generally not liking the Medici. So it's sometimes tricky to pick out from that how your average person in Florentine society who wasn't very politically engaged might have seen Alessandro, because those people often do not leave behind a record of their political opinions. And the political opinions we have got are the most polarized political opinions from either people who are really trying to defend Alessandro, or the people who absolutely hate the Medici and everything they do is terrible. So for me as a historian, some of the process of writing the book is trying to take a historical record that has often been very, very hostile, and to take that, put it alongside the documents that we do have from the period, and try and reconstruct a little bit of what might potentially have been the point of view of Alessandro and his supporters, and indeed the point of view of just your average person in the street.
The point of view of the average person in the street. All right, now, if we look at the point of view of average person in the street in Europe today, okay, let's say Italy, because I live in Italy, I've been here since 2004. It will appear to a lot of people in Italy that probably they are seeing Africa for the first time. The average opinion of the people. Now, we're talking of many years ago, 50, 30, no? This is a lot of years ago, no?
Yeah.
A person of African origin or a mixed race become a duke. Was it something that is completely unheard of in Europe? France, Florence were doing it for the first time. I mean, what I'm trying to ask here is, are we really knowing ourselves for the first time? Or somehow we have entangled ourselves in a way that we are just pretending to be knowing ourselves for the first time? Help me understand this.
So the first thing I would say is that your average person in the street in Florence would almost certainly have seen Black people before, because we know from the decoration of the Medici palace that goes back to the 1450s, we have a portrait within that palace of a Black archer at the Medici court. So we know that there are people of African descent in Florence for 80 years before Alessandro comes to power. And we know that actually one of the interesting things for me was seeing, in the records that once I started looking, it's one of the interesting things that you're not sort of paying attention, and like suddenly I had never, was never particularly looking in previous research for anything that might indicate the the race of a particular individual. But when I started looking, you do notice that there are more people. There are particularly African musicians, African dancers who are very popular at court in this period. So it's not absolutely the case that African migrants, mostly people who were trafficked as slaves into Italy, some of whom might have been freed, some of whom might not. But it's not the case that Africans would be entirely unfamiliar in the Florentine piazza. But obviously then you've got the question of how does that work when Alessandro is becoming a duke? And to what extent is that a surprise to people? I think it's a surprise to people to some extent, but the way they discuss criticism of him, it tends not to be in terms of race. And I think one of the things that's quite important to understand with this is that the modern terminology of race, like for example, the idea of a Black person, that subsequently becomes very common in Europe, is really quite new at this point. It is quite new because it grows up and becomes used to justify what is happening in the transatlantic slave trade. And the idea of a white person is not going to really be around for a whole century after that. I mean, yeah, there is colorism and color bias and color preference, and this idea that a sort of fair pinkish skin is preferable to being more tanned amongst white people. But there isn't this quite sharp concept of race that you'll get later on. So I think in Alessandro's period, that helps us understand why it's perhaps not as, although it might be in later periods, is it quite surprising that somebody of mixed heritage could become a Duke of Florence. But at the time, I think, particularly given that there had always been a lot of African migration into southern Italy, and a lot of very long-term, over centuries, over millennia, with the Roman Empire population mixing over time, that for a lot of people, maybe Alessandro wasn't necessarily perceived quite straightforwardly as Black. Certainly that isn't a term that gets applied to him in the documents of the period.
All right, that's interesting. Now, I'm trying to imagine a society, a European society where they have never seen Africans before. So they brought in this illegitimate African child. Let's even forget that the father ever had sex with the mother, and that is how they came. Let's say they went to Africa and they bought this child and they brought him. And somebody make him a ruler over white. I think that is highly unlikely. What I'm saying is that at the time that Alessandro was the Duke, like you also pointed out, there were also other people like him. Help me clarify this.
So I think that look, I think that one of the reasons that Alessandro is able to become duke is because because it's generally accepted that Alessandro's father is a member of the Medici family, probably Lorenzo, possibly Pope Clement VII, but generally they accept that. And because this is also a quite sexist society, who your father is really matters. And so, what Alessandro can do, having a father in the Medici family, even though he's not a legitimate member of the family, is very, very different to what any other child brought from Africa into Italy could do. It's really, really vital to understanding his story to understand that it's about the fact that he has a father and he has that kind of blood from that side of the family that gives him this, it's not quite aristocratic, but gives him this sort of credibility as a ruler because he is one of this family and they have chosen to accept him into the family. So in almost any other case, you can't quite imagine that working in the same way. Now, we do have examples from the 16th century, from the later 15th century, of Africans whose service in Italian states is very highly valued. So we have, for example, we know there are African soldiers in the Venetian service. And one of them, and we've got a case where one of the African soldiers who's fighting for Venice is killed at war, and his widow gets a very, very generous pension, which suggests to me that, they're not going to be paying that pension if they did not think this guy was doing a very good job. So it is possible to, rise on merit in the military context there. But as I say, this is not, I think in Alessandro's case, it really is the Medici father who sort of determines his prospects, because I think that is, that makes an enormous difference.
Mm-hmm. All right. I don't know how far the argument can take us in this line, because I like the fact that you made mention of race. So that is why I really am trilling this a little bit, because I find it very intriguing and interesting,
Yeah.
Actually, what I'm trying to put across is that in the 1300, it wasn't the first time that the Florist people were saying Africans. Otherwise, it would not make any sense at all that you bring somebody of African origin to first of all come and, because children are not produced in the laboratory. They are produced because a man and a woman decide to have a relationship and they have a sexual intercourse. That is where it happens, no? It doesn't happen because I went there and collect it because it fell down from a tree, so I bring it home, I bring a rat or a cat, no?
Yeah.
You must have to consider yourself equal to another, then you go into a relationship, then because the child the child usually come later. It doesn't just come first, no?
Well, you
All
see,
right. Yeah, please.
Okay, no,
Yeah.
I would just say I think we have to be a little bit careful about that story of people being equal in a relationship, because I think unfortunately one of the quite realistic possibilities, and I have to say we don't know the facts of the relationship of Alessandro's father and mother, but unfortunately we do know in the general situation that there is a lot of sexual exploitation of enslaved women that goes on in these Italian households. And there is the story, we do know that some of the sources, including sources I would consider relatively good quality sources from people who know, say that Alessandro's mother was a servant or possibly a slave in the household of the Medici. Now, that raises also quite problematic issues around the power dynamics of what that relationship might have been. If she's a servant, can she really very freely consent to having sex with one of the members of the family, whether or, however that's put, whether it's by force or whether it's not. It's a really, this is quite a difficult dynamic, but I think it's one we have to kind of face up to and say, she may not have had a lot of choice in the matter. So yeah, there is that very quite unpleasant background potentially to the way that Alessandro comes into the world. So that's also something I think to consider. We do know, there are other cases where we have marriages between Africans and Europeans in this period. That also happens. So we know there are kind of, free relationships recognized in the eyes of the church, but this particular one is not one that's a relationship of marriage or anywhere or anything like it. It seems to be, from the sources that we have, a relationship with quite a lot of inequality in the background.
All right. You are the historian, so we are listening to you. Okay. I don't really know if Alessandro's father was going around raping women. I want to believe that there is a kind of a relationship somewhere that produced the children. Whether it is actually a marriage or no, I don't know.
I mean, I think on the other side of that, there is this thing that Alessandro was acknowledged eventually as a member of the Medici family, which means that, which sort of implies that there was possibly enough exclusivity in the relationship to know that he was not, for them to be sort of feel confident he wasn't somebody else's child. I mean, there's also a document that perhaps hints, although it's not 100% reliable, at a legacy being left to somebody who I would say is a possible candidate to be Alessandro's mother. But it's these sources are so shaky. It's quite it is quite difficult to work out exactly what's going on there.
Okay, that is fair enough. Another thing actually I'm trying to also understand, within the time that we are talking about now, where Alessandro was born and eventually grew up, because what people often think is that Africans got to Europe by means of slavery. That is what I want to clarify, that it is not true. That is not the case. If we say that Alessandro's mother was got to Europe as a slave, okay, let me even take it from that. Let's even take that is the case. Now, let me ask you like this. Like Alessandro, is there any other person that you have found within a similar situation, maybe in another part of Italy or in Europe, that we might say is not as a process of slavery? I'm trying to see if there is any way that we have had a kind of relationship apart from being slave to another. That is what I'm trying to clarify.
I mean, I think that certainly the research that I personally have done does not sort of do a big examination of the slave trade between West Africa, as it is by this point, and Europe. But so far as I understand it, the majority, there are some free black people in Italy, some people of African descent. But the majority arrive there through some connection with the slave trade. Now, sometimes, not absolutely necessarily, there are people who come as, for example, expert musicians, expert dancers, so even with them, however, it's often the roots of migration are connected with slavery, and it's difficult to be clear with any given individual whether or not they are a slave. It's quite hard from the records. But I think there is not, at this point, a lot of free African migration to Italy. I just don't particularly think that's the case. I know there's a kind of, I mean, I can very much understand the sort of desire to try to be clear and very clear about the fact that all African history in this period related to Europe is not about slavery. And I think the point where you see that Alessandro actually seems to me to be somebody who is more likely to have a connection through slavery. If you want people who are not connected through slavery, there are certainly examples. So a lot of the examples on that front, however, come from are in relation to Ethiopia, and they're examples of people whose connections are through the church. Because of Ethiopia being the Christian part of Africa at this point, you get, for example, a whole monastery in Rome, the monastery of Santo Stefano degli Abissini, which is a monastery of African monks. In Rome, near the Vatican, still exists. So you get that kind of migration, not engaged with the slave trade. That's a kind of separate thing. You get ambassadors who come from Ethiopia. You get a kind of exchange of diplomatic relations between Ethiopia and the papacy. So I think it partly depends, I mean, again, on which part of Africa you're talking about the extent to which relations with and migration into Italy are likely to be connected to slavery or not, because it seems to me that the bit where you get a lot of free relations is in relationship to Christian East Africa, and the bit where relations are more likely to have to do with slave trading are to do with West Africa. So it's not absolutely straightforward, but I think I would tend to think about there being more than one route of engagement and international relations, and those are somewhat geographically connected.
Yeah, absolutely. There should be more than one connection. Because
I think there's a lot more. There's a really good book by Verena Krebs about the Ethiopian Christian connection, which I really recommend. You should get her on your podcast to talk about all the Ethiopian kings and their relationship with Italy, because that's a really interesting whole perspective on this topic that is only just very recently probably coming out in the research.
That would be interesting. I would love to also have that view here. The point is that I don't like ignorance, because I think we have the possibility of knowing. We have the possibility of able to explore and understand. I think that is also the work that people like you, historians, are doing and should do more, giving a kind of a clear balance of situations. No, because look at it. Europe and Africa is separated by a small stretch of water. So to tell me that we are just knowing ourselves for the first time, oh, come on, I'm not a baby, we're not going to take that.
Oh, no.
Also,
I think there's lots I think there's not, but I think the interesting thing is obviously, over millennia, there is migration into, across that strip of water in the Mediterranean. And of course, like through the Roman Empire, I mean, there are lots and lots and lots of Romans. Obviously, the Roman Empire colonizes and then kind of invites into citizenship a lot of people from all along the north coast of Africa. So there's a whole history of very, very long-term migration and population mixing that goes on there. And I think that's also a big part of this story. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not the case that there's a sudden change, but I think there is some distinction between I mean, you get documents, that is rather terrible document from the Marchioness of Mantua, Isabella d'Este, very, very famous Renaissance woman and collector, who sent a note to her agent in Venice saying, well, I want you to find me a little slave girl who is as black as possible. And so it seems to me that there is, amongst the aristocracy of Italy at this time, there is a certain amount of fetishization around skin color of African servants, that is slightly different from the way that you might encounter African migrants to Italy who had kind of come of their own accord and settled into villages in the south and just got on with their lives. So I think there's a kind of particular treatment there that it seems to me is like a little bit different in terms of its quite unpleasant quality that really did happen and sort of which we ought to be kind of conscious.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Surely there are many of those stories around. There is no argument about that. That is true. But what I'm saying is that a lot of Africans and Europeans have engagement that was not based on slavery. So when we talk about the interaction between African and European, I don't think we should limit it to slavery just for the sake of helping us to diminish the image of Africans in relation with the Europeans. Because when you were making mention of the fact that race as when other historians probably have cited the case of Alessandro de Medici, they usually make mention of race, make mention of the fact that it's coming from African, or using N-word to sort of degrade his importance as a ruler. That is part of the narration of saying that there is nothing else between Africa that connects Africa to Europe other than slavery. That is what I'm actually saying. That's why I'm saying that it is not true. Africa and Europe are too close to have just been meeting only at the point of, at the transatlantic slave trade, for example. In the city where I live, the patron saint is called San Zeno. It's also from Africa. So maybe that also, we can, if that is if the narration is that the Africa get to Europe through slavery, then that also is a slave, you know. So I think we need to clarify that. We need to really be very clear on that. That we have a lot of relationships that are not based on slavery.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. And I think the more research there is, particularly into the, the links of multiple early church thinkers. I mean, for most obviously, I guess, St. Augustine of Hippo, North African background. There's a whole world of that early Christian engagement across Mediterranean, which is very, very important to development of the church. We have all those links that continue. There's a whole set of relationships between Europe and Africa, which are to do with trade, which are to do with, to say, the examples of military service. There are all sorts of stories that we can tell that are not about just saying, well, it's from the 15th century and it starts with Portuguese colonization and building forts and so on. And that is, I think, an important story. But as you say, I think you're absolutely right. It's not the only one. And as you go back into the medieval period, back to the later Roman Empire, there are a whole load of ways that one can talk about the history of African and European interactions that are not about slavery, or that sit alongside a slave system. In the case of the Roman Empire, where slavery is not defined on an ethnic basis. Roman slave, I mean, all sorts of people can be enslaved in the Roman system, and that is not something that maps onto skin color as it comes to do later on in the 16th and the 17th centuries. So yeah, I think absolutely this is a story that needs to be broken down, needs to be thought about differently. And within that, I mean, Alessandro is somebody who, perhaps has that background. Certainly the sources tend to point in the direction of an association with slavery in his mother's case, but then, manages to thanks to his father's family connections, rise to be ruler of a major Italian city-state. I mean, that's a very different sort of story from perhaps the one that we expect about slavery and victimhood. And for that reason alone, I think it's an important story to tell.
I'll move to the story of Alessandro just now. Before I get there, since you are a historian and we love history so much in this channel, because basically history is telling us where we are coming from, I'm going to ask you this. Yes, there are different channels through which we can narrate how we have engagement, Africans, European. Of course, I'm an African, I'm in Europe, so I'm directly at the center of the story. It is important for me. Now, we have the line of slavery. We have the line of religion. Do we have anything about economy, trading, a kind of interaction where somebody move from Africa to get to Europe and get involved in business, in dealing with people, without the necessity of him be taking? I'm not looking at Africa be taken. I'm looking at Africa that came on its own to do something before, let's say even the Roman time, before the Roman, or just after the Roman. Tell me something about it. It can even be in England. It doesn't necessarily have to be in Italy, but just since we are thinking, let's just think freely. Yeah, help me.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are certainly people who, in England, things are very different because certainly in England, although, they're often, when Africans arrive in England around the same time, there is some connection through slavery because England does not have slavery within its territories, within its mainland territories at that time. The Africans that we find in 16th century London are free. They're not enslaved. They can't be enslaved. Later on you find yeah, things get a little bit shakier because the law accommodates the fact that there is slavery in a wider British Empire. But at this time, yeah, so we have somebody who called a guy called Reasonable Blackman, who is a silk weaver, for example. We find people doing all sorts of artisan jobs. We find people doing specialist diving work, for example. So we have a couple of Venetian divers who are originally African, and they come via Venice and they work on salvaging objects from a shipwreck in the just off the south coast of England, and that's in the middle of the 16th century. So certainly there are plenty of skilled African artisans who are working in different roles. Often, yeah, there having been some connection to their initial arrival that has to do with transport on ships from slave trading countries, whether or not they are personally enslaved. But then, yeah, settle down, and we can track their marriages and baptisms and kind of engagement in the local community. And I think there is research ongoing around examples of people in similar situations in Italy. And obviously Italy is kind of distinct from England in that regard, because there isn't the kind of, if you get to England in some ways and you have been made a slave, then you kind of get lucky to some extent, because that can't necessarily be continued once you're in England. In Italy it can be, because Italy has a domestic law that the Italian states allow slavery to continue on the peninsula in a way that England did not. And I think, so this is a little bit of a distinction according to where any given African migrant might live. But yeah, absolutely, there are people doing all sorts of artisan jobs. And obviously, in terms of shipping across the Mediterranean, yeah, we see people come and go in all sorts of different places. I mean, there are, examples of people in Mediterranean navies. We've got, and as I say, in armies as well. So there's lots of, I think one of the things is that there's still lots and lots more to do in terms of digging in the archives, finding exactly what was going on and how many different Africans in Europe were doing exactly what. And there are researchers doing that work now, but it still is yet to come out and yet to be published.
I don't know if you want to spend some more time there before we move to the Alessandro story, because I have a few things to ask there. Because, why I'm trying to sort of stress on this question is so that we can correct the error that when you look at African, it is a lone person who have never left his continent. The only reason he could live there was because somebody came to take him out to another place. That is how he knew Europe. I think that is wrong. It is not true. When Hannibal was coming to attack Rome, they didn't need the European to come and take him. If we continue to go on the narration that Africa only got here through the help of another person, I think that is not fair enough. So, historically speaking, is there any trace that you can find of Africans that have got into Europe on their own? Is there anything you can share with me?
I think the issue here, I think, is that nobody is sitting there in the south of Sicily ticking off in a book the boats that come across. Like, this is, and clearly, like, there are lots of people who just come and go, but this is not a world with border controls in the same way. I mean, yeah, there are questions about who is a citizen and who is entitled to assistance and so on, but you can just go places. I mean, you can take a small boat and sail across the Mediterranean. And I mean, the thing is, for historians, one of the tricky things that nobody is monitoring that. So we have not got no records with which to show exactly how many people are moving. And we have also got no records. I mean, monitoring by, asking questions in official surveys about race. It's a very, very new thing. I mean, why would you specify if you're a local lawyer in Sicily, for example, and you are writing a contract document? I mean, you no reason to write down anybody's skin color in that contract document, but yet those contract documents are very often the only sort of evidence that we've got of the ordinary lives of people who are engaged in business or buying and selling a field to farm. So a lot of the time we just don't have the documents to know exactly what any given person's origin is, unless for some reason somebody in the system has decided to write down, African or black or from Guinea or one of the other kind of indicators that might give you a hint. But most of the time, I mean, you go out and, I don't know, buy a car or something, you take out some finance to buy the car, they don't put in that contract document where you're from. They just put your name, right? So that's kind of what we have to deal with, like, as historians, is that a lot of the time it didn't feel relevant to anybody to write this down, and so we don't actually know exactly what's happening with that kind of with that element of voluntary migration, which I'm sure exists, but it's kind of one of those things. It's sort of irony that because slave traders were dealing in buying and selling, they cared about keeping records of their money, they produced a lot of paperwork about what they were doing. So they've got really good records, because there was a load of money involved. And whereas, people who were just moving for their own business, the documents just don't kind of survive in the same way. So it's much, much harder to piece together that side of the historical experience than it is to do for the thing where it was a lot about the white Europeans trying to make themselves some money. This is the real challenge that I think we've got.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that is true. And when that is the situation, it is a very tedious work to do. And what I often say to African academia, African writer here, is that you will be doing a disservice to yourself when you are expecting the European to tell your story, because it will never happen. Because it's difficult for them to even tell their story. How could you expect them to tell your story? Because now, look at... Yeah.
Well, I just want to say as well that I think, like, a lot of European historians until very, very recently, and even to some extent now, are quite, were quite suspicious of and quite hostile to the fact that in a lot of Africa, history was traditionally in oral form, right? It wasn't written down. So Europeans kind of wrote down history in history books and had a written record of history, whereas in a lot of African countries, it was more typically sung or recited. There's an oral tradition of doing history. And a lot of Europeans just kind of thought, well, that's just not as valuable as our type of doing history. And so therefore they would kind of discount a lot of historical knowledge because they didn't sort of see it as being proper according to their standards. And I think now, like, the attitudes towards that are somewhat beginning to change, but it's still a very there's still a lot of European historians out there who kind of think that if it wasn't a written text, that it's not quite as good. So that again is another big barrier to get over in understanding historical relationships between Europe and Africa, because it's like the typically European historians and also African historians who've had kind of come to Europe and had the European training in how to do history properly, as we put it, like get a particular view that has really valorized European sources over the oral tradition of history that you have in Africa.
Well, that is where it becomes a little bit intriguing, in that we need to see the world through the face of the European, but this too is wrong, because this I think we are pretending to be what it is not. What it is plural. Life is plural. There is Europe, that is Africa. We cannot understand Africa through the lens of the European. That is absolutely wrong. That is why also I don't want to blame it on the European that a lot of African reality is not interpreted in the European context. That is not the duty of the European. The European is to tell his story. The Africans is to tell his story too. Now, let's go back to where we were before, because I'm not even pretending to expect you, Dr. Catherine, to be telling my story. It is not your duty. I am the one telling my story. I think this is what Africans should do, all of us. Now, when you look at that intriguing part, where maybe, for example, you were saying, why we usually make reference to slavery and to religious context in terms of looking at the relationship between African and Europe, because these are the ones that are documented, no? I understand that. So to go and dig out the ones that were not really documented in a way that it can be interpreted for you, it's a hard work, I know. A lot of research, digging and all that. Because the people that were living 1,500 years ago or 300 years ago, they didn't know the kind of life we were going to live. They didn't know that we were going to be computer, internet. They didn't know that they were going to document it for us to understand. They documented it for them to understand. For us to be able to understand them, we need to go and dig it up. It's expensive. So again, I repeat, it is not your duty to tell my story. Everyone should tell his story. And it is really disadvantageous for many Africans looking at the way it is really in a raw state, expecting that, okay, because they are telling the story, it's going to be balanced. Well, that is a lot there. Let leave it like that, okay? Now, I want to ask you, Catherine, which is the most interesting thing that you find in your research about Alessandro de' Medici?
Oh, wow. That's a, you know, the thing I found most fascinating was the fancy dress costumes. So this is so Alessandro and his courtiers like to get dressed up for their parties. And in his wardrobe records, I have a whole sort of stack of costumes that they wear. And what's really, really interesting is that some of these costumes are described as being for Moors. So for like the word Moor as it's used in Italian, Moro at that time is kind of a little bit vague word, but it can be Africans, North Africans, Muslims sometimes. But it's really fascinating to me that in these boxes of clothes, that amid the kind of conventional European outfits, all in sort of black velvet doublets and so on, very standard, we have these costumes where we have these characters of Moors sometimes, also of gypsies, also of hermits and so on. It's very interesting to me to think about the, the possibility that on the one hand, Alessandro's enemies are saying, oh, he's unsuitable to rule because his mother was Moorish. And then on the other hand, he and his courtiers are dressing up as exactly this thing that they're being criticized for being. And perhaps I really like the idea that there they are just saying, well, we don't care. You can say that this is a bad thing to be, and yet we are going to go out and we're going to wear on costumes and we are going to be that thing. And so I think it's an interesting, to what extent is this playing around with reclaiming an image that they are not meant to have, that they're being told that is, makes Alessandro an illegitimate ruler. It's very, and I really, we don't know exactly what went on at those parties, but I'm just fascinated by the idea that yeah, on the one hand, you would be being called Moorish almost as a slur, and on the other hand, you would then be saying, yeah, well, hey, we will dress up exactly like the Moors at a party.
Yeah, that is interesting. In fact, I'm visualizing the party, and I can see that it was interesting. It was really interesting. What is not interesting is along the line, we continue to fabricate a lot of things to tell that party. And that is no longer interesting because we remove a lot of element in it, and it becomes very pale, very, very one-sided, very uninteresting as a trend, because when we remove too many contradictions, it becomes colorless. Whereas what makes life interesting is the diversity in it. I think the people in the ancient world understood this. In multi and plural society, take a look at even Egypt, for example. It was not a single one type of people that were there. This is evident. We also have it in West Africa, the metropolitan city, the Empire of Mali. Because I think we are supposed to live, all of us involved together, a little bit of you, a little bit of me. You are a little shorter, I'm a little taller. You are a little bit thinner, I'm a little bit fatter. This is what makes it more beautiful. I think the story should also be told like that. Not just one side, but there are very many versions of it. That is what makes us more beautiful. And that is what makes it more rich, more perfume, more intriguing, so that we can dance, so that we can feel it. If it is just one-sided, it is very lowly.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, no, okay. I agree, yeah.
All right, thank you for that. Here, I'm just thinking aloud. Okay, now, what is the central message of this book?
I just really wanted to put Alessandro's story out there in a way that was, I hope, like, accessible and interesting for people to read, and let them, have the historical facts that I could find. Let me give my best attempt at an explanation of what was going on, and then really to let readers take away from it what they would. I don't want to tell people how they ought to think about Alessandro. I mean, he's an incredibly complex character. There are a lot of things that he does that you might not particularly approve of a ruler doing, that, I'm not sure you would always, I would always particularly want to live in the Florence that was becoming increasingly dictatorial under the Medici. But on the other hand, it's just an incredible, thrilling story, I think, of that kind of astonishing rise from somebody who was never expected to rule to somebody who becomes, as I say, Duke of one of the major Italian cities. So I just wanted to, try and piece together how that had happened and say to readers, look, here it is, you can choose yourself, what you think of this guy in the end. I'm just going to try and give you some of the tools and the expert interpretation with which to do that.
You see, I've taken a look at your Amazon page. I see that this is one of your most popular books, if not the most popular. Mm-hmm. So what are your readers telling you? When you have a conversation with them, what did they tell you?
Oh, I think a lot of people just love the story because it's one of those sort of real life thrillers. There's that family rivalry at the heart of it. It's a very human story about people wanting things they haven't got, or being given things they shouldn't have, or that their friends think they shouldn't have. So I think it's got that kind of element to it at the heart that makes it a very sort of attractive reading experience. But and then it is something unexpected. When I was first writing this book, and I was telling colleagues that I was writing about somebody who was a mixed race prince in Renaissance Italy, they would say, like, really? Is that possible? And a lot of people didn't quite believe that this could be a true story. And I say, well, look, there are multiple sources here. Yeah, it's not 100% secure, but even just starting with what we've got and then thinking about the possibilities is in itself like really, really intriguing to me. So yeah, I think it just is a story that on the one hand has all the classic ingredients of a thriller, and on the other tells people something that often surprises them about the European and the African past.
That is very interesting. This surprise, I think we really do have the possibility. I think I said it before. We really do have the possibility to know about us, where we are coming from, but sometimes we don't know enough. Is it because historians are not writing enough, or because the information is taken away from the people, that we are ignorant of the thing that is just in front of us? Why is it like that? I'm asking your opinion.
I think sometimes it's that nobody has yet done the research, and the information is there to be found, but nobody has yet done that work of sitting down and looking for it, which can be a very slow, painstaking experience. Other times it's, like I was saying before, it's because nobody thought that was interesting information to hold on to in the first place. So they never kept the records of, the ordinary people in the town or village and what they did, because, they weren't earning enough to pay taxes. So what was the point? There was like no reason to write down those details, and lots of people couldn't read and write, so they weren't writing down those details for themselves. So I think there's a combination of different things. There's certainly that some historical topics, haven't had as much attention as they could. And then there's areas where things are just really not knowable because we don't have the records, because nobody at the time could keep those records or thought it was important to.
Thank you so much for that. All right. We have talked about a lot of things relating to your work and what you do, but that is something I really haven't asked you. I think it's important that I do. Mm-hmm. What do you like more about your work, what you do? I mean, what gives you more energy to continue to do this? I understand that you make money from it, but more than that.
Yeah, I mean, I really love that experience of going into an archive and finding something that you really did not expect to find, and thinking, oh, wow, this just really changes my perspective on the thing that I was studying. And that doesn't happen very often, but when it does happen, it's great. And I also really like the satisfaction of being able to take all these different pieces of information and draw them together into a story, into a book that kind of will kind of help organize them and make sense, will make the jigsaw look complete to people who are reading it. And I think that I really enjoy writing. I like thinking of ways to explain different aspects of the past. And so, it can be a frustrating process sometimes, but getting to the end of the book and thinking, I've been able to draw these different threads together is a very, very satisfying process for me.
That's interesting. All right, now we'll come to the conclusion of the conversation, but I usually leave the guests to make their own conclusion, because it has to be made in your own way. Maybe it's a message, maybe you want to greet somebody. I don't know, anything you want to say to conclude the conversation, or you want to reinforce any line, any argument before, please.
Oh, well, I guess what I would say is that, we're now in a world where we're living sort of 500 years on from Alessandro's own life, and coming up for, only 10 years off the 500th anniversary of Alessandro becoming Duke of Florence. And I would really, really love to see that actually being marked in a really big way in Italy and across the globe. And I hope very much that some of the people who are listening to our conversation today will, be interested in participating in that. And if you would like to start thinking about how we can do that, then I would love to hear from you. I'm very easy to find online. Do feel free to get in touch and start talking. And perhaps we ought to be talking to the big museums and galleries about, what they are going to do to mark this part of Italian and African history.
That's interesting. Thank you so much, Catherine. It has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
You're welcome. If you enjoy this podcast, make sure you subscribe so you never miss any of our future episodes. Rate and review Obehi podcast and share with your friends who might need it. I remain Obehi Ewafo. Thank you so much for listening, and talk to you in the next episode.